So thank you very much for being here, Todd. I think the logical place to start is on the budget, since that's a big part of your campaign and it's the most current issue to sort of be presenting the board with challenges. So I wonder if you could outline for us exactly what you think should be the approach to dealing with the deficit, and then address this in forums, but as succinctly as you can, summarize how you think the board should be handling the current deficit.
Sure. Well, before I do that, I think it's important to understand where the deficit came from. And I think this isn't it took me a long time to figure it out, even going through it and experiencing it in real time. The underlying driver of the deficit is the teacher contract. The misforecast of the property tax revenue was basically just the precipitating event. But what happened is the teacher contract put us on the edge. As someone had said, it's like you spent every dollar you had on your new house, but you didn't figure the water heater might break or the roof might leak or something else might go wrong. And then what do you know, it does. The problem isn't that your roof leaked, the problem is that you were at the edge already. And so the teacher contract, both in terms of its size and in guaranteeing the second year of the raise in advance, which we had never done before, put us in a situation where anything going wrong would have precipitated a shortfall in the kind of situation we're in now. So we're in a situation, we've got somewhere between $4 million and $5 million of deficit. And I think the path out, there's really two forks in it. There's a fork in it. One path is the path they're on, which is do very little this year, fill the hole with various reserves and borrowing, and then run some kind of process to try to identify savings for next year, and then hope we implement them. As Ken Dauber said, that's sort of like quitting smoking by saying, I'm going to smoke for a year and then I'll figure out how to quit smoking. The alternative is to start cutting now and to start identifying real options that could be executed this year to protect reserves and limit borrowing. And that's not a mysterious process, it's not a complicated process, especially if you start at 25 Churchill with headquarters operations and personnel. And, it's funny because there's been a lot of talk about an inclusive, thoughtful process. Well, I don't know what kind of process we anticipate to run. They'll say, how important is the communications officer? Or how important are second level HR staff? I don't think that's something that the people at the sites have much view on or insight into. I think that's strictly in the hands of the managers at 25 Churchill. And so I think what I've been calling for, and I think some others, is a list of what are the things that could be cut this year that would have an impact on the bottom line. That will help protect our reserves so that we have them when the eventual cyclical downturn comes. So I think that's the main thing I would love to see would be the board given a set of kind of priority ranked options, things that could be cut, primarily at 25 Churchill or in administrative positions at the sites, that would let them save money this year to protect reserves and to give us more flexibility in the future.
And what would be at the top of that list for you?
Well, before I answer that, let me just say, I think it's not a great practice for the board to generate the list, and I think it's actually inappropriate for management or the superintendent to say, hey, board, you're so smart, you tell us what the answer is. And he hasn't. But I get that occasionally from people in the community. And I think, it's important to understand the role of the board versus the superintendent and the staff. They understand the operations. They're the people who are charged with the day-to-day running the district. They're the people who know where the opportunities are to cut way better than any board member. But one obvious place that I've seen, I know others have pointed out, is the communications director. That's a recently added position. 2 of the 3 board members voted against adding that position as unnecessary. In the recent past, there were times where we didn't have that position. That person's paid a fair amount of money, well over $125,000, especially with benefits and overhead. And, while it may be nice to have a full-time communications officer in a situation where we're paying his salary with our reserves, the question is, is that more important than saving those reserves for eventually paying the teachers that we may have to pay with them when the cyclical downturn comes. So that's an obvious position, and I think there are probably others. There's been a lot of staff added at 25 Churchill and the administrative layer at the sites, and that's $13 million, and I think that's the obvious place to start looking.
So obviously you and others have the benefit of hindsight because this crisis occurred after the adoption of the budget and after the approval of the union contract. Had you been on the board at the point that the 3-year contract was presented, what would your position have been on it, assuming that in the course of the negotiation you obviously would have been outvoted by your colleagues? So faced with a situation as it came in front of the board in public session in May, what would you have done?
I would have voted against the contract, and I said so at the time. I think there were two fundamentally things about the contract that we should have done differently. One is that the raises were too high. As we said, we took everything we had and put it into the raise so that if anything went wrong, we were going to be in deficit. That's obviously, that was obvious in hindsight. It was fairly obvious in foresight, and Dr. pointed it out over and over, and I agreed. The other thing that I think was less obvious, but was the immediate reaction I had the day the contract was released, was that we entered into a forward contract that guaranteed the second year of the agreement. We have never done that in PAUSD, and I actually went and looked at 30 basic aid district union contracts. There's no other basic aid district that I could find that guarantees the second year of the contract without either unilateral outs, where if something goes wrong or we change our mind, we can just renegotiate, or a formula that says if it goes up so much, you get so much, or if it goes up a little more, you get a little more, but if it goes down, we get relief. So no one guaranteed a number forward, which says to me that all our peer districts figured out that the revenue is too volatile or too unpredictable to actually guarantee forward salaries. I think that those two things were both fatal flaws with the contract as presented, and I was very disappointed when I saw it. So I would have voted against.
Do you think there's any inherent problem with the way the negotiations are being handled currently? Both that specific point that you made about the lack of foresight with the second year, lack of flexibility. There's something wrong at the staff level?
I don't know if there's something wrong. People raised this issue of potential conflict of interest with Dr. Bowers. I know Dr. Bowers. I think he's a very fine, outstanding person who has the best interest of the districts at heart. That said, there's no reason to have that kind of, even the appearance of conflict is not appropriate, I think, in a public agency. And, why leave those things, if you have enough bad opportunities for bad things to happen, bad things will eventually happen. So when you see them, you should remove them. So I think changing that and perhaps having a professional negotiator or some kind of agent come in and do the negotiation on our behalf might be appropriate. The other thing about it is, as I think others have pointed out, and this was very striking to me, is that the negotiation process, which went on a very long time, the community had no visibility in it at all. And that really struck me. I vividly remember it was a Friday afternoon when the contract was released. And as I said, I was quite taken aback with both the amount and the form. And on top of that, then the superintendent asked to waive the 2-meeting rule on it, and they were going to try to approve it on Tuesday. And I felt, holy cow, this is literally the biggest contract that the district has ever entered into. And it was negotiated without any public input, and it's possible the entire public exposure to it before voting on it will be 3 days, over the weekend. And it's like, that didn't seem right. So I think others have suggested that there might be opportunities to check in with the community or sunlight some of the direction of the negotiation with the community, or have some kind of public meeting in the process. I think I would welcome that, because I think it's a good idea to think about how to innovate with our contracts. We don't need to be stuck with one model forever. I've looked at a bunch of contracts now. There are things other people do that I think we would probably benefit from. But you need to have, if you're going to try to do something novel, it's very useful to have check-ins along the way, so if you're taking a misstep, someone could say, hey, did you know, or did you think of this? I think that would be helpful.
Would you favor a public hearing then of some sort before the contract is ratified by the teachers union? So kind of hearing of this is what we're proposing right now?
I think that would be a good idea. And I mean, because that was one of the things that struck me is when the contract was finally released, it had already been approved by the teachers, which made
And the board in closed session.
and the board in closed session. So it made it, I felt kind of awkward even standing up and saying, hey, I'm not sure I agree here, because like both sides had already agreed. So what was going to happen? I was going to look like a jerk. So I think something before decisions are made was obviously helpful, but even something before that, I mean, just something so that people who, I mean, there are a lot of talented, experienced people in the community who care a lot about the schools. Giving them some kind of forum where they can say, hey, this is what we're thinking. What do you think? I think would benefit all parties. I think you'd have to get the union to agree. I mean, I think I think there are sensitivities there. It's a two-part process, so you have to get both sides to agree. But I think that would benefit the community.
Would you take the position as a board member that, at least from the district's perspective, that union negotiations themselves should be open to the public?
I don't know. I've thought about that. I've seen that suggestion.
Well, it actually is, a current provision of the contract is that those negotiating sessions are open.
Unless one of the other side
And
says,
the district has always agreed to close the session. I don't think there's ever been an open session.
interesting. I certainly don't have any principled opposition to it. I think it might be useful to have some sessions open and some sessions closed. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that could be, given that there's a provision, if you could decide on a case-by-case basis whether this meeting will be open or this meeting not, I think that might be a useful way to sunshine some of the progress while having an opportunity to bandy about proposals without necessarily having them be, made public.
So to ask one follow-up on this question, on this issue, the difference of opinion that seems to exist on the board regarding the need to act sooner rather than later to adjust the budget for these circumstances almost arises to an impasse kind of situation. I mean, no one is budging on that, and even the acknowledgement that this is a structural problem that is going to plague the district down the road in future years doesn't seem to be in sharp focus for either the community or the board.
I agree.
So as a new board member with financial expertise and having observed the way this board operates and the personal dynamics behind this board, how as a board member would you try to bridge and bring together these disparate points of view so that we kind of shifted gears to a more collaborative and problem-solving approach rather than a positioning approach?
That's a great question, because that really gets to the heart of kind of not just this problem, but a lot of problems. I think that's key. And I think of the way that we addressed the bond issue that we had 3 years ago, which I think you guys are familiar with. And what we did there was we came up with someone took the lead of putting together a presentation that said, this is a way to think about it, this is a way to frame it. It wasn't staff, it was community, it was me. And sat down with individual board members and said, here's a way to think about this problem. And I think when people looked at that, it was helpful because it was something most people, and including me before I started looking at it, were completely unfamiliar with, how to think about different bond alternatives and what was at stake between one and another and even what they were called. But once you kind of boiled it down and put it on paper and gave everybody kind of a framework for how to think about it, almost everybody thought about it the same way. The board ended up voting 4-1 to change the bond structure. I think the same kind of thing is true here. I mean, as you said, one of the things that really struck me is that what I focus on more than anything else about the budget situation is the 5-year forecast. And I'm going to talk about that again tonight. And almost nobody looks at the 5-year forecast. I mean, it's really striking to me because at first that was the only thing I looked at. I didn't really care about this year, next year. It was, what does this mean for us over 5 years? What I found is that most people just are not that interested in it, and the board hasn't spent much time talking about it or thinking about it. So I think there needs to be an education process where people sit down and say, let us think about how to think about this problem. Whether as a board member it's appropriate to do that. I mean, it was funny because it was good being an outsider, being a community member doing that, because I was kind of a neutral party. I was advocating a certain position on the bond, but I didn't. They could ignore me if they wanted to because I wasn't on the board, and I would just go away. And I think that helped because I was kind of a third party. To have a board member do that might be more contentious, but I think there are lots of people in the community who can fill that role. I'm certainly not the only one. I think getting people who have that expertise to come in and talk about it, I think would be a very useful thing to the board. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So last year you served on the enrollment management committee, and you headed up the elementary subcommittee.
You were there?
I was there often. Towards the end of this process, you came out pretty strongly against the secondary subcommittee's proposal to explore opening a third alternative, innovative high school, and you wrote a guest opinion piece about it. And among your criticisms were that the secondary group's involvement in this proposal to actually seek funding for this new school was that it made it impossible for the board to rely on the group's objectivity and impartiality. And there was some sort of pushback from the other, your co-members on the secondary subcommittee. Do you still feel that it was as cut and dried as they maintain, that they just wanted to look at opening a new school? And in hindsight, is there anything that you would do differently or communicate differently about it, the whole process of being part of that committee?
That's a good question. I do feel so good. You need a good process to get to a good outcome, particularly in a public agency like this. Because we want the community and all the stakeholders to buy into what comes out of those committees. And what really, what I thought happened there is that we had some breakdowns in the process that made it difficult to feel comfortable that the results could be relied on. And personally, having really good visibility into the underlying analysis that went into those results, I would be honest, I was confused about why they were recommending some of the things they were recommending. As you know, I wrote a 16-page analysis of their analysis saying why I thought the results were different, the conclusions were different based on the same data they were looking at. I did feel that the way the process was run generated a potential appearance of partiality. And it was very hard to tell because it wasn't visible at the time how those people came to be involved with the execute committee. One of the members of the committee, as you know, came onto the committee because he was a specific advocate for a particular kind of school. That's how we first met them. And he wasn't on the committee at the beginning, and then by the end he was, and there had never been any discussion on the committee about this person joining. And it was just kind of surprising, and it made me feel slightly uncomfortable as the facts unfolded. So I wish I had done anything differently. I can't tell you exactly what it is. I think as a result of that process, people became uncomfortable working with each other, which is very unfortunate in a community as small and tightly knit as ours. One of my very, very strong beliefs is that we're all on the same side of the table here. We're all working for the kids and all trying to build a school district and a community that we all live in and neighbors. And so anything that makes people feel uncomfortable, like they don't want to participate, probably should have been done differently. I can't tell you exactly what I would have done differently, but in hindsight, I wish it had not wound up that way. And I'm sure there are things I could have done.
Well, I want to push you a little bit further on that because the makeup of the committee that you're talking about and the way that committee kind of got off track, I think pretty clearly with the information we now know is a result of Superintendent McGee's steering of that committee and his active participation.
You know more than me. I haven't seen the emails.
And the active participation in the execute proposal. So I guess my question really is, what is your assessment of Superintendent McGee's approach to these kinds of community committees? And are they committees that operate with fidelity and integrity and impartiality? And if not, what responsibility does the school board have to try to correct that situation?
Very fair question. I can't speak to the committees generally because I have deep insights to the one I served on and limited insight into others. So I'm sure I would overstate. I wouldn't be able to say with high confidence how all the committees work. I do think we have a community that's very attentive, that pays close attention and cares a lot about both the process and the outcome. And that's one of the reasons why running great processes that will stand up to scrutiny is so important. I mean, we see it with the elementary math adoption we were talking about earlier, where, if we waver from what the process is, it will come and bite us later, because someone will be unhappy with whatever the result is, and they will correctly come back and find legitimate criticisms of the process, which will create unnecessary controversy and distraction. It doesn't help the kids to have that kind of controversy at the end. It just distracts us from the work that we're all trying to do. So while it's more difficult and perhaps takes more time and may not always yield the outcomes that people want, it's really important to run, I like the way you say it, to run these processes with fidelity so that you can stand up in front of anyone at the end and say, I understand that you don't like the answer, but this is the way we agreed to run the process. This is what was recommended. And we don't have any, and as a board member, I don't have any good reason to substitute my judgment for the recommendation. I think that actually very rarely happens now, and it's not just under Dr. McGee's stewardship, but I think it's always happened that the very uneven work product from the committees and the boards, sometimes taking the advice and sometimes just completely disregarded the advice of these committees, as is their right. But I think if we ran good processes, I think the board would be more likely to pay attention and have to give good reason to waver from the recommendations of the committee. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I'm trying.
I wanted to touch upon something that you said last week at the forum about the homework policy. We've heard some varying opinions on whether or not that is currently being implemented well, whether or not we're seeing some results. And you basically said that the district has failed in a way by not having an evaluation system, a monitoring system, and I was wondering, could you please expand on that opinion and tell us what you think might work better?
Yeah, sure. It's like the homework policy is like what they say about socialism. You can't say it doesn't work because it's never really been tried. We have a policy. The policy does not have, I wouldn't say the homework policy hasn't been implemented. I would say there's no way for us to know whether it's been implemented or not because we don't have any monitoring or any mechanism for enforcement. This is particularly true at the high school level where, the policy calls for, as you guys know, a certain number of hours for a student's entire course load over a week's time. There is literally, as far as I know, no way that for any given student you can arrive at that number. I mean, the student doesn't know, the teacher doesn't know, the administration doesn't know, the district doesn't know. So if we don't know, then we don't know whether the policy is being followed or not. There may be, and there certainly are teachers who have tried and reduced their homework loads. There certainly are people who are concerned about it. And I think we've seen a reduction and improvement in homework in the district in the last couple of years. So, in some sense, I think there are people who say, well, just talking about it has been good. But we shouldn't have policies just to talk about it. We should have policies to actually implement them. And I think it was a failure of the board. And it's not just a homework policy. I think this is something that we've probably improved on over time. And I've heard Dr. McGee talk about this, is that we kind of did a lot of things by the seat of the pants and things that seemed good. And we just kind of did them and talked about them and passed policies and moved on to the next thing. And now we've been moving into a more rigorous approach where we say, okay, what are the metrics that we're going to use to understand whether this is being successful or not? Which drives you back for something like a homework policy is like, well, what's an enforcement mechanism? Now, For homework policy, I know two ways that people have suggested doing this. One is using Schoology or using some app to actually capture homework loads on a course-by-course, section-by-section basis, and then you can add it up across individual students. That requires everyone to put everything into Schoology with estimates of how long it would take, and then somehow to check whether the estimates are right. But that could be done. It sounds like a good destination, but it might take us a little while to get there. The other short-term measure that's been suggested is just do some auditing. I mean, Terry Godfrey suggested this at the board retreat last summer. Let's just pick a kid or 10 kids or 20 kids and do an audit. And do one first semester and one second semester, so we can get a sense of, is the policy being followed or not. My experience, and I think most people's, is if you're not looking at all, the chances of people following the policy is kind of not very good. But if you start looking even just a little bit, just like the IRS, right? The IRS doesn't audit everybody's taxes, but they don't need to, because we all kind of worry. It's like, what happens if they audit mine? So I think if they knew there was some auditing, some reviewing going on, then everyone would be a little bit more attentive to it, and we'd probably get more fidelity to the policy.
If you were on the board, is this an issue that you would take action on? Is this a higher priority for you amongst the many, many issues that you're on?
Yes, I think very much so. I think the homework policy is one of the central pillars of our social emotional health initiatives, and goes to a wide range of things. Not just, it goes to student achievement, it goes to sleep, it goes to stress in the school. I think it's actually was a very important step forward for the district, and I think it's very important that it be implemented appropriately.
This is perhaps a good time to ask you about zero period, which probably falls into that same category. I know that you said that you support the ultimate outcome there of the elimination of zero period, if I'm recalling your comments correctly at the debate, but you were critical of the process. On a basic evidence-based health decision such as that, I think ultimately was viewed as, what should the process be? The popular thing for candidates to say is we need to be more consultative with the students, we need to hear their points of view.
Yeah.
But if the ultimate outcome is pretty well established in the evidence of the need for sleep, right, and the need for later start times, are we just paying lip service to the idea of consulting with students about their points of view?
Yeah.
So what was wrong with that process, and how would you have fixed it?
It's funny, because after I made those comments, I think that was literally the first time I had ever commented on that in public. And I got some feedback from people who said, hey, this was more or less along the lines of what you just said. And it was useful because the main thing that I had keyed in on and that I heard of firsthand at the time was that the students were torqued because Dr. McGee had gone to them beforehand. And I don't think he had done this with any ill intentions. I think it just worked out, unfortunately, and told them that they would have input into the process. And then in the events, it ended up being, so at that point it was being viewed as, kind of not a medical decision, but a kind of a, academic policy, a scheduling decision, if you will. And then it got recast as a medical health and safety wellness type decision. And it's like, okay, so this is not something where we ask all stakeholders what we think. Everyone has to wear their seatbelts. And I think the students were quite torqued, not just because they weren't consulted, but because they were not consulted after being told they would be consulted. That was, I think, a breakdown in process that was really unfortunate. And I think that was a situation where the students, and I'm not sure, this might have happened, I was not aware of it happening, but it might have, that the students deserved an apology. Not because they didn't have a voice, because to your point, wearing your seatbelts, we don't get a voice, but because they had been led to believe they would be consulted and then summarily were not, and only afterwards were told, hey, we're sorry, this turned out not to be an issue we were going to consult you on. Sorry about misleading you about that. Which, any of us would be pretty torqued about that. So I think student voice is really important, but you're completely appropriate to separate health and safety and wellness issues from things that appropriate to consult stakeholders. So.
Were you surprised by the fact that the board voted not to discuss zero period?
I'm trying to remember at the time. Not especially. As you know, I think it's important for the board to figure out where their bailiwick, their zone of influence ends and where staff begins. In fact, many of the things I've seen go wrong in boards over the years stems from confusion around those roles and one side or the other overstepping. So I tend to think that the board actually was prudent in saying, hey, this is a decision that's within the discretion of the superintendent and the staff. And while we could weigh in on this, it's, it's not necessary and they should just carry out what their recommendations.
Does not that just lead, though, to behind-the-scenes attempts to influence the outcome of a decision? When you take a decision like that and you put it behind closed doors and leave it up to in theory, leave it up to the administration.
Yeah.
It's taking it out of the public view, and with something as controversial as that turned out to be, then one wonders, well, who is influencing this decision and why?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And I think that actually is a rather pervasive issue in this district, because issues that one would expect to just be decided by administrators ends up getting kind of all mucked up and sort of going to the board for their feedback. The board rarely votes on much.
Yeah.
So they give their feedback, and then it returns to the superintendent, and everybody's left kind of wondering, okay, where do we go from here with this issue?
Right, and good point. I didn't connect those two issues. I see where you're going with that. Yes, it is really bad, and I think the board's gotten better. This particular board has, or version of the board has gotten better. I mean, if you go back 3-5 years, the board almost never voted on anything. And they just take a sense of the board and, Dr. Skelly, do you have enough? And it's like, sure. And he'd go do whatever he thought was right, which, I mean, who wouldn't want that? But that's not appropriate. As you said, it's not appropriate for the board. It actually ends up being, I think, it undermines the superintendent because he's second guessed now. And it is much better to have discussion and vote on issues that rise to that level of importance. I think the issue with zero period, and the reason I didn't really connect it, is because it is a health and safety issue. And I didn't see at the end of the day the board really having much latitude in it. So I wasn't sure what the discussion would have looked like.
Well, because the superintendent was wavering on it was the problem. I mean, he was arguing that we weren't anywhere near ready to make a decision because we needed to gather more information and find out what all the impacts would be. And it was going to be a process.
Oh, you know more of the details than I remember then.
Yeah.
Yes, if genuinely, I was under the impression that the superintendent had arrived at a conclusion and recommended it to the board, and the board declined to vote, and the superintendent did vote. If that's not the case,
That's not what.
If that's not the case, then yes, it would have been appropriate for the board. Sure.
I want to switch gears to another sort of student-centered and family-centered issue in the district, that's special education. I know you were at the board retreat this summer when the board heard the preliminary results of a sort of in-depth evaluation being conducted by a group of researchers from Harvard on the district's special ed services. And there were some positive findings, encouraging statements from this group, but also in the report they said that currently having a disability in PAUSD is associated with academic failure. And during the same discussion, Melissa Baden-Caswell said, our culture right now is let your kid fail in terms of kids with special needs. Do you agree with those statements? Why or why not? And what is the number one action that you would take as a board member to facilitate better relationships with special education families and improve services for students?
As I think you guys know, I'm a special education parent. My son who's now 17, is severely autistic and attended special need classes in PAUSD for a number of years, and is now at a what they call a special placement paid for by, he was referred there by the district, and it's paid for by the district. So I have a lot of direct experience in this, so there are a lot of good things about our special. It's funny because everyone says that they come to Palo Alto for the schools. Our family honestly came for the special ed program. I mean, my older kids would have done fine anywhere, but we really needed a district with a strong special ed program for the needs of my son, and we found we had a positive experience. And I think there are other families who do. However, you talk to a lot of families who do not have a positive experience. And you hear the same kind of things over and over again, which was less about, it's related to failure. But what in fact I hear about most is it's difficult for me to get the services that I think my child needs and is entitled to. I don't understand the process, or I feel the process is sort of rigged against me, and I don't, and you hear especially a lot of younger parents talk about whether they need to get a lawyer. I mean, we've gone through annual IEP reviews now, 12 of them, and we've never needed an attorney or felt the need for an attorney. But I hear a lot of parents say that they feel the need to have an attorney to make sure they get what their child is entitled to. That's not good. That's not good. Being a special needs parent, I can tell you, is a large burden on a family, and uncertainty about, when you're in Palo Alto and you know your district has resources, and that's part of the reason why you're here, to feel like you may not get the things that you need and that you're going to have to fight really hard to get them, that's a very uncomfortable feeling. That doesn't benefit kids, it doesn't benefit families, it ultimately doesn't benefit the district. So we need to address that. I think there are a couple things that we can do to address it. One is just communication. There was talk, I think, at that same retreat about how there's no onboarding handbook for families. They literally don't know what to expect, and they kind of have to figure it out. And gosh, I remember when we entered the special needs system, you're like a blind man, searching around, trying to figure out what the heck, and you feel this sense of urgency because it's your child and they don't have what they need, and it's very stressful. So making a process that was more transparent, I think, to the families and allowed them to share their experiences more, because there's a real feeling that you're compartmentalized, and I'm not getting what this person got, and they might get something else, and they try to keep us separate so they negotiate with us. I don't know how much of that actually happens, but there's certainly a perception that it happens. I think the other thing is the biggest issue with special ed is that it costs money. We've implemented this full inclusion special ed approach, which is great. I think it is absolutely the right direction, and it's absolutely the right direction. It is very difficult to implement, and it's very expensive. A special needs child in the mainstream kind of general ed classroom often requires an aide, often a full-time aide. We have there's a regional-wide shortage of those aides, and even if you can fill the spots, which we can't always do, there's high turnover in those positions, and the people aren't always well-trained. And to be effective in that situation, you have to know both the teacher and the child. And so high turnover really makes it difficult to implement those strategies. So we're going to have to spend more money to make sure we have the aides that are required to implement those programs appropriately. Which gets back to the budget, of course, because if we're not able to solve our budget programs, I know Dr. McGee says, special ed will not be cut, and I know that's what he wants. I believe he's highly sincere. I think the truth is we need to spend more in special ed. It's not that we don't need to cut; we need to spend more, and so we need to get our budget under control so we can put our resources where they're really most needed. Does that?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to take you back to the OCR issues that this district has dealt with over the last 4 years, and ask for you to give your assessment of where you think the board took the right and the wrong moves on OCR, and in particular the resolution that was adopted in June of 2014 criticizing the OCR investigative process and so forth. I wonder what your assessment is of the OCR matters.
I wouldn't have voted for the OCR resolution I think that was a mistake. It doesn't pass the test of putting our time and resources and attention toward helping kids. In that, I think disputing with a federal agency over process and so on was not going to help our kids. So I think that was a mistake. I understand the board members were frustrated with the process and didn't like where they were. Gosh knows I find myself in situations like that in other organizations I'm involved in. But sometimes you just have to put your frustration aside, and even if you think you're right or you are right, it's like this is not a battle that's appropriate for me to fight, particularly as a steward of a public agency. So I think that was a mistake. I think it would have been far better for us to do what most districts do, which is when the OCR comes in, which is thank them for their advice, implement it as quickly as possible, and move on.
And what do you think led to the approach that was used?
I wasn't intimately involved with the discussions, of course. I think there was one underlying cause that I think has been somewhat addressed, that Dr. Reeves helped address, which is the site-based management. I think really undermined. It went too far, and so things like bullying policy being implemented differently at different schools. Or other complaints. That's an invitation to trouble. And I think a number of the OCR issues were not that the situation was handled fundamentally wrong, or the outcome here was fundamentally wrong, or the outcome there. It's that the process was done wrong. And it's like, we've got to follow the process. And I think we had gotten to a point where we thought that we didn't need those processes, or where our decentralization reached a point where we thought it was more appropriate for the site to work out the process. I think that worked out just to be wrong. And we need to have uniform processes and understand that the rules apply to our district, our schools, our administrators. We have to do it the right way, because those processes are there to protect us all. And they're there to protect us all, so we need to follow them.
When Poly Principal Phil Winston resigned his principalship at Pali, and we later learned that it was in part due to a whole series of allegations that were found to be true by the district, and was reassigned to Jordan. The school board at the time opted to take no direct disciplinary action against him other than a warning letter. And then it was some 8-9 months later that they terminated him after the whole thing became public.
Right.
Understanding that you don't have all the information that the board had at the time, but given that they later changed their view of what to do about Phil Winston, and it cost the district $150,000 to get him to leave, I wonder, in hindsight, looking at the way that was handled by the board, what voice would you have raised? What would your viewpoint have been had you been on the board during that period?
In my experience, Bill, it is better to take, if action's required, it's better to take it. I think there's a real tendency, and that's not just PAUSD, it's most organizations, to say, gosh, if we can avoid conflict or avoid scandal or avoid whatever, let's avoid it. And, we'll kick the can down the road a little bit. It'll be okay. Hope for the best. I think I've learned the hard way over 35 years of working in different organizations that it usually is the other way. Usually, if there's something that needs to be done, you should just do it. If it costs you some money, you should pay the money. If it costs you a bad article in the paper, then you have a bad article in the paper. One of the things that I like to say about PAOSD, because I feel it very strongly, is that we tend to be very defensive about things, but we don't have that much to be defensive about. We're far from perfect. We got a lot of areas we can improve in, but we do a pretty good job, and we have really good people, and we have a lot of satisfied families and parents and stakeholders. So I tend to err on the side of, let's be candid about what the issues are. Let's talk about them. We're all adults here. We're all neighbors. And let's try to just work through them and get to the next place. Because if you look at the 10-year history of the district, the time I've been really involved intimately with the district, there's been self-inflicted wound after self-inflicted wound, controversy after scandal, And it's like, it doesn't need to be that way. And so I think one of the steps is to acknowledge that we're not perfect, address the imperfections as soon as they come up and move on to the next thing before they become a scandal and a problem.
I wanted to ask you about a happy conundrum that Palo Alto finds itself in every now and then.
Oh, I love happy conundrums.
Happy conundrums. Wealthy individuals who are interested in giving major donations. This brings up issues of parity and transparency, of course.
Yeah.
And even in the Addison situation right now, the district does not actually know who's donating this money. So what kind of procedures or policies would you support for future donations? Should the superintendent and the board absolutely know who this donor is? Should that person be revealed only if it's above a certain dollar amount? Is it okay to have a completely anonymous donation?
It's a really interesting question. I did some research on it when it came up. It was interesting. I talked to some people over at the endowment office of Stanford about what their policy was. And it turns out Stanford would not accept a gift like that. They would require either the president or maybe the vice president of development or the general counsel to know who the identity of the donor and vouch for that they wouldn't hurt it would be in the interest of Stanford to take the gift. Now the challenge in PAUSD is, so that was kind of interesting because I'm sure it's come up in their history and of course they had a policy. In PAUSD, it's a little hard to say. There are two issues. One is we're a public agency, they're a private institution. And the other is that it's hard to say who embodies the interests of PAUSD sufficiently to be able to vouch for its in the interest. It'd be very hard to say that one of the staff would fit that role, since at the end, for the most part, they come and work here. It's their job, but it's not their lives. On the other hand, board members who are elected officials and may, have transient terms, also difficult. I think the board had also looked at whether an outside lawyer might be able to be informed. But again, how does that person judge what the best interest of people is here? So it was interesting because I felt, at first I was like, this is great, they have a policy. And then I was like, this is kind of hard because it doesn't really map that well to our situation. But what it told me is that they had a policy. And they would not just take, if someone left, a suitcase of money on the doorstep, it sounded like they would turn it in to the police. And it certainly gave me pause here. Because I think the Addison gift is, as you say, the donor's completely unknown to the district. It's being handled 100% through an intermediary. And that would really give me pause.
Well, so what is your position on the proposal that's sort of emerging regarding anonymous gifts over $50,000?
Can you remind me exactly what it is?
So the superintendent would know, and then he would inform each of the board members in confidence over the phone, so there's no public record.
Oh, I didn't
We talked
realize.
about this morning.
Was that worked out in BPRC?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I hadn't heard that.
And also, if it's over $50,000, any gift, whether it's anonymous or not, the board has to be able to approve it to avoid the House Addison as well.
Okay, well, I'm presuming that they got legal counsel. So the issue is whether that knowledge would be a public record that would be discoverable in some way.
Well, it's a policy that's designed to evade the Public Records Act. Is what it amounts to.
It is, yeah, and I guess I have concern about that because, it's funny, because maybe we'll talk about private email.
That was going to be the next.
Yeah, that's the obvious relationship. Structuring processes to evade the Public Record Act is probably not something that public boards should spend a lot of time on. That's literally the first step of that policy. I haven't had a chance to review it. So I don't really know. But while I think that's clever, it probably is not in the spirit of the way we want to handle important information. If it's important, then the public should know. If we decide that it's not important enough that the district know, then that's okay too. I guess offhand, if you really were to put me in the corner, which obviously is what you'd like to do,
We're here for.
that's what you're here for. I would probably have a policy that we would need to know the donor.
The public would need to know.
Yeah, well, I don't see any way. I would love for there to be a way that the district would know and somehow be able to vouch the way you said. But, like I said, the difference between Stanford and us is they're a private institution with a public agency. I do think it's hard for a public agency to say, we're going to know something. We collectively, the superintendent, the board, will know something, but we're going to handle it in a way, and not within the scope of closed session, and we're going to handle it in a way that the public can't find it out. Once we start down that slippery slope, it's like, well, what else can we have phone calls about? That sounds like an inappropriate. It doesn't sound like a great strategy to me.
And what about the issue of parity? Do you have any concerns that one school will be just so much better than other schools, and some schools lagging behind because they don't have, individual wealthy donors?
Well, as you know, we have a policy. We have progressive parity, and that came up with the Addison discussion. And I actually am reasonably satisfied with the way it's played out in the case of Addison, in the sense that the Addison project, to my understanding, was actually scoped back somewhat from its original conception because there were things that it was just exceedingly unlikely that the district would ever agree to do with other schools. So the project was scoped back to something that would be comparable to what we plan to do with other schools. And then in conjunction with it, we released the $60 million that were remaining in the bond to go start doing the long overdue innovations at the existing elementary schools. So I feel pretty good about that, but I think that progressive parity thing, it's more relevant. It becomes more relevant when you start looking at Palo and Gun, which I think has now gotten to the edge of where it may be going too far. As you guys probably know, in the bond program originally from inception, 2006, 2007, the allocations between Palo and Gun were slightly different. Palo had $20 million more than Gun allocated to it, and there were reasons. It's an older campus, and because the site is so old and the plans are uncertain, there were contingencies built in that turned out were needed. They would excavate things and find out the underground plans where there's no relationship to what was actually there. So they spent a lot of additional money there just getting the same projects done. But if you add the pure gift, you're now at $45 million more spending on one campus than the other. And, that gym's going to be a beautiful gym. That theater is an unbelievable theater. That Media Arts Center is a fantastic Media Arts Center. And the buildings at Gunn are very nice too. But I think when you stand back and look at the two campuses, they are not going to be as comparable as I would like. And so, should we be fortunate enough to have another bond, I think we should definitely spend more money at Gunn to bring it up to a comparable place. I think that's the intention.
A couple of issues I want to hit on before we run out of time, so maybe we can try to be as brief as possible on these. The teacher evaluation pilot that's been underway, where students are doing these evaluations at the end of every semester, got some good discussion last week at the candidates night. The issue of whether the results of those surveys should be a matter for public dissemination, virtually every candidate hedged a bit on that, including yourself. And I want to see if you've had a chance to think about that a little further and ask you again whether the evaluations in the aggregate form regarding the teaching, the high school teachers and their classes should be available to parents and to students when they're done.
What would the benefit be? I'm not saying there isn't any. I'm just curious to get a view of.
Well, I'm not sure I want to get into a dialogue with you about it. I think there are benefits. Among them is that it potentially takes the place of what amounts to a lot of rumor and private gossip among parents and students that favors certain families because they have certain connections and friends that they then can steer clear of certain teachers and seek other teachers. I saw this happen repeatedly in elementary school and middle school in Palo Alto with my personal experience. And I think it is a significant issue. The parents in the know what teachers to get their kids in front of and to avoid.
Interesting. Okay. As I said at the forum, this is close to my heart because not only was I in college did they have this kind of review, I worked on it. was one of my main undergraduate activities for the 3 years of my college experience.
Yeah, it was incredibly common and useful.
And we had a book this thick, and every professor, and one of the things we did is we'd have statistical results, and then we would try to summarize and cherry pick the verbatim comments and give people a flavor of what the evaluation was, and that was just part of the furniture. I mean, of course, how else would you choose your courses if you didn't have a course guide that said how the professors were and how hard the work was and all these other things. So I certainly have been in a world where that was absolutely common and not controversial in any way. No, you're giving me food for thought. I'm trying to think. I certainly understand why it would be sensitive to the teachers, and so there would have to be a process by which it was introduced and the teachers helped make comfortable with it, because I think it could be jarring just to say, here it is. But it's an interesting thought. I see your point. I guess I haven't thought about it more since we talked about it. And my initial instinct, like everybody else, was, gosh, we should be careful with this data. It could be uncomfortable for people. But, along the theme of what we were talking about, sometimes being a little uncomfortable is preferable if it helps us get to a better place. And getting information out there is usually one of the things that helps us get to a better place.
Well, I think one of the frustrations in a district that has as many outstanding teachers as this one has is that there is no effective way to help usher out the ineffective teachers in a tenured system as we have. And there's a certain degree of powerlessness on the part of parents and students who year after year see a poor, ineffective teacher continuing to teach and give students a bad experience. And so it seems to me that anything that can bring a little more transparency without it being overly intrusive. This is a protected group of employees, and it seems to me that one of the things you may need to give up if you're tenured in exchange for tenure is that more public form of feedback.
I think it's a really interesting idea. What I would probably do, and this is actually the general way I try to figure these things out, is like, we're a suburban school district here. There are a lot of suburban school districts in California around the country. I bet we're not the first or the 50th or the 500th people to actually run into this problem and think about it. So let's benefit from what others have done. If there are good implementations out there, maybe we can learn from them or adopt them. If people have tried this and it's failed, we can figure out why and either avoid the misstep or say, this is why you don't do that, because this is an insurmountable problem. We can learn a lot by looking at what other districts do, and sometimes, the teacher contracts, the most proximate example, where we don't, we put our head down and we say we focus on just our own thing, and we totally miss that, hey, lots of other people have thought of this problem before, and if they're not doing it, why are we so smart? Maybe we're not.
The other thing I wanted to touch on is site-based decision-making, and that's a big topic, and we spent a lot of time talking about it, but the student journalists from both Gunn and Pally asked a question last week that I felt that the answers in general were somewhat dismissive of the concerns that they were raising.
Uh-huh.
And what they were basically pointing out is that, in their opinions, there really is not equitable access to learning opportunities between the two high schools. And that wasn't, I don't think they were trying to say that one high school is better than the other, but if you are assigned to Gunn and you really care about pursuing, for example, a social justice pathway or theater or a variety of things that might be offered in a different way at Pally, that doesn't feel right to them. And almost without exception, the candidates said, the schools just need to be roughly comparable.
Yeah.
And everything is going to be we don't want things to be exactly the same. And it seems to me that mindset is so pervasive in this district that it extends also to things like that one would assume we'd have standardized practices over. You brought up counseling at the meeting.
Yeah.
And finally, after how many years, just sort of through osmosis, we're now going to go to a unified system of teacher advisory counseling system. Board never voted on it.
Yeah.
It never reached some decision point, but people got so tired of hearing about it that at a retreat over the summer, by virtue of the comments everybody made, it was clear that, okay, I guess we're doing teacher advisory at Gunn now.
Yeah.
But this is such a deeply rooted attitude, which is our schools are so different than the school communities are so unique that they need to have the ability to put in place their own version of everything, basically. Right. So we have the Gunn version of small learning communities. We have the Pali version of that. Even to the rather frivolous example that the students gave, which is at Gunn, it's not allowed to put the name of the college that you're going to on your graduation cap. But at Pali, it's perfectly fine.
I'm very familiar with that issue.
So how, as a board member, what is your philosophy about this? And is this just the way it is in Palo Alto? Or is there a direction that that in your opinion, we ought to be moving in a different fashion toward?
Yeah. That's a good question. We do best when we learn from each other. So I think at the other end of the spectrum, if we were centrally organizing and said, I vividly remember once I saw an interview of the Minister of Education in France who said, I can tell you at what page of what book every third grader in France is on at 10:30 on Tuesday morning. Because it was all school is nationally centralized there, and the curriculum and everything is very tightly. So that's one end of the spectrum. I actually think that end of the spectrum is inappropriate for us because our kids are very different, our teachers are very strong, and if you have that kind of, you really stifle innovation if you have that kind of approach. You have to have centralized innovation, I guess. At the other end, where laissez-faire, letting school go its own way. I mean, in some sense, we've been there. I think we had been as decentralized as any district like ours was likely to be. And I think that yielded some really suboptimal results. Counseling is one of the most obvious. But also, to your point, I mean, I think, there are some great successes. I mean, the journalism program at Pali is one that really stands out in my mind. They have, one of the best journalism programs in the country, maybe the world, for all I know. And, Gunn has not benefited. If you're a student at Gunn, you do not get the benefit of that program. Gunn has a perfectly nice journalism program, but it is not comparable in any way to what the Valley does. So that's not great. So I think we've had this approach of, like you say, organic osmosis. If one group, is doing something better, the other group will figure that out and want to adopt it. Well, we've learned, the hard way, I guess, that takes too long and even often doesn't even get to where you think it would get. So some kind of identifying best practices and trying to facilitate transfer, and if necessary. And I don't know if there's any institutional mechanism for that right now. What you tend to see in a larger organization is there'd be some centralized group that said, hey, let's have the high school coordination committee under the auspices of the chief academic officer to identify best practices at school one and programs at school one and figure out how we can bring them to school to facilitate that transfer over time. I'm not aware of anything we have like that in PAUSD, and that's what I'd expect is right now we're just kind of hoping that it happens, but hope, as famously was said, hope is not a strategy. So we need to actually help it happen, and to me that probably means some process that's facilitated centrally that involves the stakeholders of both sides, that consciously tries to manage transfer of good practices from one school to the other. I think that would help. I don't know if that would really solve the problem. I don't know if there's a problem that really lends itself to a solution. But I think it would help mitigate where we are now, which is I agree, some real unevenness among the offerings at one school and the other.
Is there any final
That's it? Nothing else?
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.